Mom can't
Mom
stand
can't
up.
stand up.
Please, hurry, come see. Please, you have to come now.
Please, you have
Annie's
to come
small
now.
voice trembled as she
What?
clutched the sleeve of the man beside her, pulling with a kind of urgency no child should have to carry. She's over there, please. Daniel Whitmore stopped mid-step. He looked down at the girl. What's going on? He asked. His voice calm, but firm. What happened to your mother? Why can't she stand? Annie swallowed hard. They hurt her, she said, pointing toward the interview area. She tried to stand, but she can't. Please, just come see. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. Show me. Annie turned immediately, pulling him across the marble lobby. They reached the interview corridor, and in the middle of it, a woman on the ground. Marla lay sprawled just outside the interview room, one leg twisted awkwardly, her hand gripping her ankle tightly. Her face was pale, her breathing controlled but strained. Around her, people moved carefully, stepping around her, not toward her. Annie ran to her side. Mom, she whispered, dropping to her knees. I brought someone. He's here now. Marla looked up, her eyes briefly meeting Daniel's. There was pain there, but also something else. Daniel stepped closer. His gaze shifted to the floor around her. Torn papers, scattered. He bent down and picked one up. Then another. The edges were jagged, ripped with intent, not accident. He turned one piece slightly and read the name. He looked at her. Is this yours? He asked, holding up the torn resume. This file. Does it belong to you? Marla nodded, her voice steady despite the pain. Yes, that's mine. Daniel straightened slightly. What happened? He asked. This time, Marla answered. Her voice was quiet, but clear. I was waiting for my interview, she said, her hand still gripping her ankle. I checked in, sat where I was told. Everything was fine at first. She paused, drawing a slow breath. Then the recruiter came out. She told me the position had already been filled. I asked her to double-check, because I had an appointment scheduled. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the hallway. She didn't like that. Marla continued. She said I was being difficult. I tried to explain I had traveled here, that I just needed a fair chance. Her fingers tightened slightly. And then, it turned into an argument. She grabbed my file, Marla said, her voice tightening just slightly now. She tore it in front of me. When I stepped forward, she pushed me. Annie's hand tightened around her mother's sleeve. You fell, Annie whispered. Marla nodded faintly. My ankle twisted when I hit the floor, she said. I tried to stand, but it wouldn't hold. Mr. Whitmore. Linda Carter stepped forward. Her posture was flawless. Her expression composed into something professional, controlled. There seems to have been a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. The candidate became emotional after being informed the role was no longer available. She escalated the situation. Daniel didn't look at her immediately. He still held the torn resume. Then slowly, he raised his eyes. To be clear, he said, his voice even. You're saying she tore her own documents and injured herself? Linda nodded without hesitation. Yes, she replied. Unfortunately, that does happen. Some candidates struggle with rejection. Annie stood up abruptly. That's not true, she said, her voice sharp with emotion. You took her papers, you ripped them, and you pushed her. Linda's expression flickered, but only for a moment. Sir, she said, turning slightly toward Daniel. It's important we don't rely on a child's version of events. Emotions can distort. Did you push her? Daniel's voice cut through hers. Linda blinked. I know, she said quickly. Of course not. I would never. Daniel lifted the torn paper slightly. And this? He asked. Did she do this to herself too? Linda's composure tightened. I can't speak to what she did in frustration, she said. But I can assure you, enough. Daniel stepped forward. He looked at Linda, then at Marla on the floor, then at Annie, standing small but unshaken beside her. Then back to Linda. I asked for facts, he said, not explanations designed to avoid them. Daniel glanced down again at Marla's ankle. The swelling had worsened, the joint clearly unstable. This isn't minor, he said quietly. Then, without hesitation, call medical. An employee rushed to comply. Daniel crouched beside Marla. Carefully, deliberately, he slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees. She inhaled sharply at the movement. "You don't have to. I know," he said, and lifted her anyway. Annie moved with them immediately, her small hand gripping the edge of his coat again, walking beside him as if anchoring herself to something she didn't want to lose. Behind them, the torn resume papers still lay scattered across the floor.
Hold on tight.
But this time, no one dared to pretend they hadn't seen it. The moment Daniel turned away from the interview corridor, the balance of power in the room shifted completely. Linda Carter reacted first. "Mr. Whitmore, wait," she called out, her voice tight with urgency as she hurried after him, heels striking sharply against the polished floor. "There's been a misunderstanding. I assure you this isn't what it looks like." Daniel didn't slow down. He carried Marla with steady control, his expression unchanged, his focus fixed ahead. Annie stayed close at his side, her small hand gripping his coat as if it were the only stable thing in a world that had just tilted. Behind them, Linda quickened her pace. "Sir, the candidate was being disruptive," she continued, her tone shifting rapidly into polished justification. "We have protocols in place." She raised her voice. "She stepped into my space." Daniel kept walking. Linda reached them again, slightly breathless now. "Sir, if you'll just give me a moment to explain." Daniel stopped. They opened automatically, revealing the cold air outside and the waiting black car at the curb. Only then did he speak. "Step back," he said. Linda froze. Sir, I just need you to understand. I understand enough," Daniel replied without looking at her. 2 security personnel had already moved into position, not aggressively, but firmly placing themselves between Linda and the path forward. That was the end of her access. Daniel stepped outside. The air was colder, sharper than inside, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the restless rhythm of the city. The driver was already at the rear door, opening it without being asked. "Hospital," Daniel said. "Yes, sir." He carefully lowered Marla into the back seat, making sure her injured leg was supported. Annie climbed in immediately after, pressing herself close to her mother, her small hand gripping tightly onto Marla's sleeve. Daniel followed, closing the door behind him. Inside the car, the world became quieter again, but not untouched. The tension from what had happened still lingered. Just beneath the surface, the car pulled away from the curb. Marla exhaled slowly, her hand still resting protectively over her ankle. The movement of the car made the pain sharper now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, her voice controlled but strained. "I just came for an interview." Daniel sat across from her, his posture composed, his gaze steady. "And instead, you were injured on company property," he replied. Annie looked between them, her brow slightly furrowed. "Are they going to be in trouble?" she asked quietly. Daniel turned his attention to her. "Yes," he said. Annie studied his face for a moment, as if measuring whether to believe him. Then she nodded slightly, as though deciding she would. Marla shifted slightly in her seat, wincing as the movement sent a sharp pulse through her ankle. She drew in a slow breath, trying to steady herself. "I shouldn't have argued," she said. "I just needed the job." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but this did. "Wanting a fair chance isn't arguing," he said finally. Marla looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the statement. Annie leaned closer to her mother. "I told you someone would help," she whispered. Marla's expression softened for a brief moment, her hand brushing lightly over Annie's hair. "You did," she said quietly. The car turned, merging into heavier traffic. Daniel reached forward slightly and pressed a button on the console. "Have the hospital ready when we arrive," he said into the intercom. "Immediate imaging, no delays." A voice responded instantly. "Understood, Mr. Whitmore." He leaned back again, his gaze shifting briefly to Annie. She hadn't let go of her mother's sleeve. Not once. Children, he thought, didn't hold on like that unless they had learned what it meant to lose something. "What's your name?" he asked. The question caught her slightly off guard. "Annie," she said. He nodded once. "I'm Daniel." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you really the boss?" "Yes," he said. Annie looked down for a moment, then back up at him. "Then, you can make things fair, right?" Daniel held her gaze. "Yes," he said again. If this moment touched something in you, take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments about where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, courage, and the power of doing what is right. The car slowed as it approached the hospital entrance. Medical staff were already waiting outside, alerted in advance. The driver stepped out quickly, opening the door as soon as the vehicle came to a complete stop. Daniel exited first, then turned immediately to assist Marla, lifting her once again with the same steady care as before. Annie followed closely, her small steps quick but determined. As they moved toward the entrance, the hospital doors slid open automatically, warm light spilling out to meet them. The hospital doors closed behind them with a soft seal, shutting out the noise of the city and replacing it with something quieter, more controlled. The air inside carried the faint scent of antiseptic and clean linen, a kind of order that didn't pretend pain didn't exist but knew how to handle it. Marla was placed gently onto a rolling bed within seconds. Hands moved around her, not rushed, not careless. A nurse adjusted her leg with practiced precision, while another began asking questions in a calm, steady tone. On a scale from 1 to 10, how bad is the pain? Marla inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening against the sheet. 7, maybe 8 when I move it. We'll take care of that, the nurse replied, already preparing a brace. Annie stood close by, her small frame tense, her eyes moving from one person to another. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything she felt was written across her face. Daniel stood just behind her, watching, not intervening but not leaving either. Is she going to be okay? Annie asked quietly, her voice careful, as if speaking too loudly might make things worse. A doctor older, composed, the kind of man who had seen enough life to recognize fear when he heard it, knelt slightly to her level. She's going to be all right, he said, but she needs rest, and we need to take a closer look at that ankle. Annie nodded, absorbing every word like instruction. I'll stay still, she said quickly. I won't get in the way. The doctor offered a small, understanding smile. You're not in the way. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly. That mattered. More than most people would think. The bed was wheeled toward imaging, and Annie instinctively followed. Daniel moved with them, not announcing himself, not directing, just present. Inside the imaging room, things slowed. Machines hummed softly. Lights adjusted. The world narrowed to what was necessary. Marla lay still as instructed, her jaw tight as they positioned her leg. The pain hadn't lessened, it had simply become something she was managing. Daniel stood near the wall, hands in his pockets. His posture relaxed in appearance but not in intention. He had seen hospitals like this before. Private, efficient, quietly expensive. Places where outcomes were controlled. Places where people like Marla rarely ended up unless something had gone very wrong or someone had made a decision. The scan didn't take long. When it was done, they moved her back into a treatment room. Annie climbed onto the chair beside the bed without being asked, her hand immediately finding her mother's again. The doctor returned with the images. No fracture, he said, placing them up on the screen. That's good news. Annie exhaled audibly. But, the doctor continued, there's a significant ligament strain, possibly a partial tear. She'll need a brace, crutches, and time off her feet. Marla closed her eyes briefly. Time off. It wasn't just rest. It was income lost. Opportunity gone. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. How long? He asked. Minimum 2 weeks before weight-bearing, the doctor replied. Longer if we want proper recovery. Daniel nodded once. Do it right, he said. The doctor didn't question it. We will. The room quieted again as the nurse began fitting the brace, her movements careful, precise. Annie watched closely. Does it hurt when they do that? She asked. A little, Marla admitted, her voice softer now. Annie tightened her grip slightly. Then I'll hold your hand harder, she said. Marla let out a faint breath that almost resembled a smile. Daniel turned his gaze slightly, looking out toward the window. The city stretched beyond the glass, busy, indifferent, moving at a pace that didn't slow for injury or fairness. For a long time, he had believed that was simply how things worked. You built your place in it, or you got left behind. But now, he glanced back at Annie. She hadn't let go. Not of her mother. Not of the moment. Mr. Whitmore, the voice came from the doorway. The man from earlier, the one with the tablet, stepped inside. We've reviewed the security footage, he said. Daniel didn't move. Show me. The man hesitated briefly, glancing toward Marla and Annie. It's clear, he said instead. The recruiter initiated physical contact. She removed the candidate's file and destroyed it, then pushed her. Annie looked up. So, you saw it? She asked. The man gave a small nod. Yes. Annie's shoulders lowered slightly. Relief. Not loud, but real. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his stance did. A quiet settling, as if a decision had just anchored itself fully. Terminate her, he said. No hesitation. The man nodded. Effective immediately? Immediately. The man made a note, then added, there may be additional complaints. We're pulling records now. Daniel glanced at him. Do it thoroughly. Yes, sir. The man stepped out. Silence returned, but it was different now. Not uncertain, resolved. Marla looked at Daniel, her expression more guarded than before, not out of distrust, but because something about all of this felt too large, too sudden. You didn't have to go that far, she said quietly. Daniel met her gaze. She did, he replied. Not harsh, just true. Marla looked down at her hands. People didn't usually take her side like that, not without asking what it would cost them. Annie looked between them. Does that mean she can't hurt anyone else? She asked. Daniel turned to her. Yes, he said. Annie nodded slowly. Good, she said, because to her, that was what mattered. Not policy, not consequences, just that it wouldn't happen again. The nurse finished securing the brace and stepped back. All set, she said. We'll bring crutches shortly. Marla adjusted slightly, testing the support. The pain was still there but contained now, held in place. Managed. Daniel stepped closer. When you're discharged, he said, you'll come back to the office. Marla looked up, confused. For what? She asked. Daniel held her gaze. For the interview, he said. Annie's eyes widened slightly. But they said it was gone, she said. Daniel shook his head once. No, he replied. It wasn't. And for the first time since the morning began, something that had been taken from them was being given back. The room grew quieter after Daniel's words settled. For the interview, they didn't sound like much on their own. Just a sentence. Just a decision. But in that moment, they carried weight enough to shift something deep inside the room. Marla didn't answer right away. She looked at him, searching not for generosity, but for intention. People offered things all the time. Help, chances, promises. But there was always something behind it. A condition, a cost. You don't even know if I'm qualified, she said finally, her voice steady but careful. Daniel didn't hesitate. That's what the interview is for, he replied. No embellishment, no reassurance he couldn't guarantee, just fairness. Annie looked between them, her brow slightly furrowed as she tried to follow the conversation in her own way. So, she still gets a chance? She asked. Daniel turned to her. Yes, that one word was enough. Annie nodded slowly, as if placing it somewhere safe inside her. Okay, she said quietly. The nurse returned with a pair of crutches, adjusting them to Marla's height. She explained how to use them, demonstrating each movement with patience. Take your time, she said. Don't rush it. The first few steps are always the hardest. Marla nodded, listening carefully. She shifted, placing her hands on the grips, testing the balance. When she stood, the pain was immediate, sharp, unforgiving. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't stop. Annie moved closer instantly, one hand hovering near her arm. I've got you, Annie whispered. Marla glanced down at her, something soft passing through her expression. I know, she said. Daniel watched. Not the injury, not the mechanics, the effort. There was something in the way she carried herself, even now, that refused to collapse entirely. Not pride, not stubbornness, something quieter, endurance. Discharge papers will be ready shortly, the nurse said. You'll need to keep weight off that ankle as much as possible. Marla nodded again. Thank you, she said. The nurse gave a small smile and stepped out. The room settled into a brief stillness. Then, Mr. Whitmore? A different voice this time. Daniel turned. Another member of his staff stood in the doorway, holding a folder. Legal has flagged something, the man said carefully. The recruiter Linda Carter has prior complaints. 3, possibly more. None escalated. Daniel's expression didn't change. Why not? He asked. The man hesitated. They were handled internally, he said. Deemed inconclusive. Daniel looked at him. Not long, not hard, just enough. And now? He asked. The man straightened slightly. We're reopening everything. Daniel gave a small nod. Good. The man stepped back, closing the door quietly behind him. Annie had been listening, not understanding every word but enough. She did that before? She asked softly. Daniel glanced at her. Yes. Annie looked down at her hands. That's not fair, she said. No anger. Just truth. Marla shifted slightly on the crutches, her balance still unsteady but improving. Life isn't always fair, she said gently. Annie looked up at her. But it should be, she replied. The simplicity of it hung in the air. Daniel didn't say anything, but something in his posture changed again. Subtle, but present. Let's get you out of here, he said. The process was quick after that. Papers signed, instructions repeated. A follow-up scheduled. Efficiency, but not rushed. Daniel walked beside Marla as they moved down the hallway. Not too close, not distant, just there within reach if needed. Annie stayed on her other side, matching her pace step for step. Hospitals had a different kind of silence. Not avoidance, like the lobby. Not indifference. Just acceptance. People here didn't look away from pain. They moved through it. Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to shift, casting long shadows across the pavement. The air carried a colder edge now, the kind that settled into your bones if you stood still too long. The car was already waiting. The driver stepped out immediately, opening the door. Daniel turned slightly. I'll have you taken home, he said. Marla paused. Something in that word home felt heavier than it should have. That's not necessary, she said. Daniel met her gaze. It is, he replied. Not forceful, not optional, just decided. She hesitated, then nodded once. Thank you, she said. He helped her into the car again, careful of her leg. Annie climbed in beside her, this time not gripping his coat but watching him closely, as if still deciding something. Daniel stepped back slightly, but didn't close the door right away. Be ready tomorrow, he said to Marla. For the interview, Marla nodded. I will. Annie leaned forward slightly. Are you going to be there? She asked. Daniel looked at her. Yes, he said. Annie sat back, considering that. Then she gave a small nod, as if confirming something only she understood. Okay, she said. Daniel closed the door. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic. He stood there for a moment, watching it go. The city moved around him, unchanged. But something in the day had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. He turned and walked back toward the building. Inside, the marble floors would still shine. The glass would still reflect. The system would still function. But now, it would be watched. And for the first time in a long time, it would be held accountable. The next morning arrived quieter than the day before, but not lighter. Chicago moved the same way it always did. Traffic pressed forward. People filled sidewalks with purpose. Coffee shops opened their doors to the same familiar faces, exchanging nods and routine greetings that carried years of repetition behind them. But inside a small, modest apartment on the edge of the city, everything felt different. Marla sat carefully at the edge of her bed, the brace secured tightly around her ankle, the crutches leaning against the wall within reach. The pain had dulled overnight, settling into something more constant, less sharp, but no less real. She adjusted the strap of the brace, tightening it slightly. Control what you can. That had always been her rule. Across the room, Annie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully folding a piece of paper. Her movements were deliberate, her small fingers pressing each crease as if it mattered, because to her, it did. Mom, Annie said, not looking up yet. What do people wear to important things? Marla glanced over. Important things? She repeated. Annie nodded. Like, when you get a chance, she said. The words were simple, but Marla understood exactly what she meant. She studied her daughter for a moment, the seriousness, the quiet determination, the way she treated this day like something fragile that could break if handled wrong. You wear something that makes you feel like yourself, Marla said. Annie looked up. But what if yourself isn't enough? The question landed softly, but it stayed. Marla reached for the crutches and stood slowly, steadying herself before taking a careful step forward. Then you remind yourself, she said, that it has to be. Annie watched her for a second longer, then nodded, as if accepting an answer she didn't fully understand but chose to trust anyway. Marla moved to the small closet, pulling out the same blouse she had worn the day before. It had been pressed again, carefully, the wrinkles smoothed out as much as possible. Not new, not perfect, but prepared. She paused for a moment, holding it in her hands. Yesterday, it had been torn down. Today, it was being worn again. That mattered. Across the city, in a building of glass and steel, Daniel Whitmore stood in his office, looking out over the skyline. The morning briefing sat open on his desk, untouched. Instead, his attention was on something else, a file, reconstructed. Every torn piece of Marla's resume had been scanned, reassembled digitally. The gaps filled where possible. The rest left visible. Evidence. Not just of what she had done, but of what had been done to her. He read through it carefully. Experience in healthcare administration, patient coordination, years of work that didn't come with recognition but carried weight. Steady, consistent, overlooked. There was a knock at the door. Come in. The same assistant from the hospital stepped inside. Everything's prepared, he said. Interview room 3. Full panel. Daniel shook his head slightly. No panel. The man hesitated. Sir, I'll handle it, Daniel said. Simple. Decided. The man nodded. Understood. When he left, Daniel remained still for a moment longer. Then he picked up the file and walked out. Back in the apartment, Annie stood near the door, her small shoes already on, her jacket zipped all the way up despite the warmth inside. She was ready, more ready than most people twice her age. Marla adjusted her weight on the crutches and took a slow step forward. Okay, she said quietly. Let's go. The journey was slower this time. Every step measured. Every movement deliberate. But they made it. And when they arrived, the building looked exactly the same. Tall, polished, unmoved by what had happened the day before. But Annie saw it differently now. She held her mother's hand tighter as they approached the entrance. Do you think they remember? She asked. Marla glanced down at her. Yes, she said. Because places like that didn't forget. They just decided what to acknowledge. Inside, the lobby was quieter than usual. Not empty, but aware. People noticed them the moment they walked in, not with avoidance this time. With recognition, the receptionist stood a little straighter. A security guard gave a small nod. No one said anything, but the shift was there. Daniel was already waiting, not inside the interview room, not behind a desk, but in the open space near the elevators. When he saw them, he stepped forward. Not quickly, not slowly, just directly. You made it, he said. Marla nodded. I said I would. His gaze dropped briefly to the crutches. How's the ankle? Still there, she replied. A small hint of dry humor. Unexpected, but real. Daniel gave a faint nod. Good, he said. Means it's healing. Annie looked between them, then stepped slightly forward. We came early, she said, as if that mattered. Daniel looked at her. That's a good habit, he replied. She nodded, satisfied. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the corridor. Let's begin. As they moved forward, the building felt different again. Not because it had changed, but because now, they were walking through it on their own terms. The hallway to interview room 3 felt longer than it had the day before, not physically, but in weight. Each step Marla took with the crutches echoed softly against the polished floor, measured and careful. Annie walked beside her, one hand lightly resting against her arm, not supporting, not pulling, just there, ready if needed. Daniel walked ahead, then slowed slightly, adjusting his pace to match theirs without making it obvious. That, Annie noticed too. When they reached the door, Daniel paused, then pushed it open. After you, he said. Marla hesitated for just a fraction of a second before stepping inside. The room was different from what she had expected. No long table filled with faces waiting to judge. No panel. No stack of resumes competing for attention. Just a single chair on one side, and Daniel on the other. Annie stayed close as Marla carefully lowered herself into the chair, adjusting her injured leg so it remained supported. The crutches rested beside her, within reach. Daniel didn't sit immediately. He placed the reconstructed file on the table, then took his seat. For a moment, no one spoke. Not awkward, just intentional. "This isn't a standard interview," Daniel said finally. Marla gave a small, understanding nod. "I assumed that," she replied. Annie looked between them, then quietly pulled a chair closer to her mother and sat down, her feet not quite touching the floor. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Instead, he opened the file. "Marla Hayes," he said, reading the name aloud. 5 years in patient coordination, 2 years in administrative support before that. Marla nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked up. "You left your last position 6 months ago?" It wasn't a question. Marla's hands folded lightly in her lap. "The hospital downsized," she said. "They called it restructuring." Daniel held her gaze. "And off the record?" Marla exhaled slowly. "They needed fewer people who asked questions," she said. Annie's eyes shifted slightly. She didn't fully understand, but she understood enough to know it mattered. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "What kind of questions?" he asked. Marla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at Annie, then back at Daniel. "The kind that make people uncomfortable," she said. "Billing discrepancies, patient wait times being reported differently than they actually were, supplies being marked as used when they weren't." Daniel didn't interrupt. "Nothing dramatic," she added. "Just small things that add up." There was no bitterness in her tone, just clarity. Daniel closed the file halfway. "And that cost you your job?" Again, not a question. Marla nodded once. "Yes." Silence settled in again. But it wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Annie shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers tracing a small pattern along the edge of the chair. She looked at Daniel carefully. "Is that a bad thing?" she asked. The question was simple, but it cut through everything else. Daniel looked at her. "No," he said. Annie frowned slightly. "Then why did they make her leave?" Daniel didn't answer right away. "Because the truth wasn't complicated, just uncomfortable. Because sometimes," he said slowly, "people protect what's easy instead of what's right." Annie absorbed that, then nodded once, as if placing it somewhere she would come back to later. Marla watched the exchange quietly. Then she spoke again. "I'm not perfect," she said. "I know how this looks. I know what it costs companies when someone pushes too much." Daniel met her gaze. "And you'd do it again?" he said. Marla didn't hesitate. "Yes." The answer was immediate, unfiltered, and it changed something, not in the room, but in how the room felt. Daniel opened the file again, flipping to the last page. "You came here for an administrative coordinator position," he said. "Yes." He studied her for a moment. "Why this company?" Marla's expression shifted slightly, not uncertain, but thoughtful. "Because you're big enough to matter," she said, "and structured enough to fix things when they're wrong." Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly. "And you think we fix things?" he asked. Marla held his gaze. "I think you can," she said. "No flattery, no performance, just belief. Or maybe expectation." Annie leaned slightly toward her mother. "That's what I told you," she whispered. Marla's lips curved faintly. Daniel closed the file. Not abruptly. Just finished. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "Yesterday," he said, "you walked into this building for an opportunity." Marla nodded. "You left injured," he continued. Annie's hand tightened slightly against her mother's sleeve. Daniel didn't miss it. "That doesn't happen again," he said. It wasn't framed as reassurance. It was a standard. Marla looked at him carefully. "I don't need protection," she said. Daniel nodded once. "I know," he replied. And he did. That was the difference. "I need fairness," she added. Daniel's expression didn't change. "That's what you're getting." The room held that for a moment. Then Annie raised her hand slightly. Not formally. Just enough to be seen. Can I say something? She asked. Daniel looked at her. Yes. Annie straightened a little in her chair. My mom works really hard, she said. Even when nobody's watching, even when it doesn't help her. Marla turned slightly. Annie, but Annie shook her head. No, it matters, she said softly. Then she looked back at Daniel. She doesn't lie, Annie added. Even when it would make things easier. The room went quiet again. Daniel didn't respond right away, because there wasn't anything to correct, only something to recognize. Finally, he nodded once. I believe you, he said. Annie relaxed slightly in her seat. That was enough. Daniel stood. The movement was smooth, deliberate. Marla looked up at him, waiting, not expecting, just ready. I don't need to ask more questions, he said. Marla's grip tightened slightly against her own hands. Then what happens now? She asked. Daniel met her gaze. You start Monday, he said. No build-up, no ceremony, just a decision. Annie's eyes widened. Marla didn't move. Not immediately, because sometimes the moment you've been working toward doesn't feel real when it arrives. Are you serious? She asked quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes. Annie slid off her chair and moved closer to her mother, her face lighting up in a way that hadn't been there before. You got it, she whispered. Marla let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Not relief, not yet. Something deeper, something steadier. Thank you, she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, he replied. You earned it. And for the first time, that felt true. The decision didn't echo. It didn't need to. You start Monday. Those 3 words settled into the room with a quiet certainty that felt heavier than anything that had come before them. Annie was the first to move. You got it, she whispered, her voice filled with something bright and unguarded, her small hand gripping her mother's arm as if she could hold the moment in place. Marla didn't respond right away. She sat there, her posture still, her eyes fixed on Daniel, not searching anymore, not questioning. Just taking it in. People didn't hand out second chances like this. Not in buildings like this. Not without something behind it. But there was nothing in his expression that suggested a transaction, only finality. Monday, she repeated quietly, as if testing the word. Daniel nodded once. HR will process everything today, he said. You'll have full access, benefits included. Your role will report directly to operations. Marla blinked. That was more than she had expected, more than she had asked for. You're placing me high, she said carefully. Daniel held her gaze. I'm placing you where you can see, he replied. The meaning settled in slowly. Not just a job, a position, visibility, responsibility. Annie tilted her head slightly. That means important, right? She asked. Daniel looked at her. It means responsible, he said. Annie thought about that, then nodded. Okay, she said, as if that made sense. Marla shifted slightly, adjusting her leg. I won't waste it, she said. It wasn't a promise meant to impress. It was a statement. Daniel seemed to accept it as such. I know, he replied. There was a soft knock at the door. Daniel's assistant stepped in again, tablet in hand. Sir, he said, legal has completed the preliminary review. There are additional reports tied to Linda Carter. 3 confirmed incidents involving candidate complaints. 2 involved physical contact minor, but documented. The room shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Marla's eyes lowered slightly. Annie looked confused. She did that to other people? Annie asked. The assistant glanced briefly at Daniel, then nodded. Yes. Annie's expression tightened. That's not right, she said quietly. No one disagreed. Daniel stood still for a moment, processing not the information itself, but the pattern behind it. Systems didn't fail loudly. They failed quietly, repeatedly, until someone decided to stop it. Notify compliance, Daniel said. Full investigation. I want every complaint reviewed, no internal closures without oversight. The assistant nodded. Yes, sir. And make it clear, Daniel added, this isn't about one employee. A pause. It's about the system that let it happen. The assistant's posture straightened slightly. Understood. He left the room. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Marla looked up again. "You're going to change things," she said. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly at Annie. She was watching him, closely, not like a child, like someone who had already learned that words didn't matter unless they were followed by action. "Yes," he said. Simple. Direct. Annie nodded once. "Good," she said, because in her world, that was enough. Marla shifted again, this time reaching for her crutches. "I should go," she said. "I've taken enough of your time." Daniel didn't move to stop her, but he didn't step away either. "Transportation is arranged," he said. "Same driver." Marla gave a small nod. "Thank you." She stood carefully, balancing her weight, adjusting to the rhythm of the crutches again. Each step was controlled, deliberate but steadier than before. Annie moved beside her immediately. "I'll walk with you," she said. Marla glanced down at her. "You always do." They made their way to the door. Before stepping out, Annie turned back. "Mr. Daniel?" He looked at her. "Yes?" She hesitated for just a second. Then, "Yesterday, everyone was looking away," she said. "But you didn't." The room held still. Annie didn't wait for an answer. She just nodded once, like she had said what she needed to say. Then she turned and followed her mother out. Daniel remained where he was, for a moment longer than necessary. Then he walked to the window. The city stretched out below, unchanged. Traffic moved. People moved. Everything continued. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. He thought of the lobby, the marble floor, the way people had stepped around what they didn't want to see, and the way a 6-year-old had refused to do the same. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. For years, he had built systems. Efficient, scalable, profitable. But now, he was thinking about something else. Accountability, not as a policy, as a choice. There was another knock. "Come in." The assistant stepped back inside. "Security has finalized the footage archive," he said. "Would you like it forwarded to your office?" Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. A pause. "Bring it to operations instead." The assistant frowned slightly. "Operations?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. Another decision, another shift, because if things were going to change, they wouldn't start at the top. They would start where people were actually seen." "Understood," the assistant said. When he left, Daniel turned back to the window. The city hadn't changed, but the way he saw it had. And somewhere below, a woman who had been pushed aside was walking back into it, not as someone asking for a chance, but as someone who had been given the space to make one matter. Monday came with a different kind of weight, not the kind that pressed down, the kind that asked something of you. Marla stood just outside the entrance of Whitmore Global, her crutches steady beneath her arms, the brace firm around her ankle. The glass doors reflected her back at herself, composed, prepared, and carrying more than just the memory of what had happened days before. Beside her, Annie adjusted the strap of her small backpack, her eyes scanning the building like it was something alive. "They're going to remember," Annie said quietly. Marla glanced down at her. "Yes," she replied. Annie nodded once, as if confirming something she had already decided. "Good," she said. They stepped inside. The lobby hadn't changed. The marble still shined. The air still carried that quiet, controlled hum of productivity. People still moved with purpose, their steps measured, their voices low, but something else had changed. When Marla entered this time, people didn't look away. They looked. Not openly, not rudely, but knowingly. A receptionist stood a little straighter. A man near the elevators gave a brief nod. Acknowledgement, not pity, not avoidance, and that made all the difference. Daniel was already there. Not hidden behind a desk, not elevated above the space, standing where everything could be seen. When he noticed them, he stepped forward. "Good morning," he said. Marla nodded. "Good morning." Annie gave a small wave. "Hi." Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to the crutches. "How's the ankle?" "Still learning patience," Marla replied. There was a faint edge of dry honesty in her voice. Daniel nodded. That's usually the harder part. Annie looked between them. She doesn't like slowing down, Annie added. Marla gave her a look. I heard that. Annie smiled faintly. Daniel gestured toward the elevators. Let's get you upstairs. This time, they didn't stop at the interview corridor. They went higher. The operations floor. When the elevator doors opened, the space was different from the polished silence below. It was active, lived in. Phones rang. Papers moved. Conversations overlapped, not chaotic, but real. Work happened here. People noticed immediately. Not because someone important had arrived, but because something unexpected had. Marla, walking in not as a candidate, but as part of the system. Daniel didn't make an announcement. He didn't need to. He simply walked forward. This is where you'll be working, he said. Marla took it in. The desks. The movement. The pace. Not intimidating, just honest. What exactly will I be doing? She asked. Daniel glanced at the floor around them. You'll see what others don't, he said. Marla looked at him. That's vague. It's intentional, he replied. Before she could respond, a woman approached mid-50s, composed, with the kind of presence that came from years of experience rather than position. Mr. Whitmore, she said, then turned her attention to Marla. You must be Marla. Her tone wasn't formal. It was respectful. Elaine Brooks, she added. Operations Director. Marla shifted slightly on her crutches and offered a small nod. Nice to meet you. Elaine's eyes moved briefly to the brace, then back to Marla's face. We heard what happened, she said. I'm sorry it happened here. No excuses, no deflection, just acknowledgement. Marla held her gaze. Thank you. Elaine nodded once. Let's get you set up. Daniel stepped back slightly. Not leaving, but not leading anymore. Elaine guided Marla through the space, showing her a desk positioned where she could see most of the floor movement, interactions, patterns. From here, Elaine said, you'll notice things others miss, timing, flow, where problems start before they're reported. Marla listened carefully. This wasn't just a role, it was observation, responsibility. Annie sat in the chair beside the desk, her feet swinging slightly as she watched everything with quiet focus. So you're like a detective, Annie said. Elaine smiled faintly. In a way, she replied. Annie nodded. That's important. Marla glanced at her. It is. Across the floor, a few employees exchanged looks, not judgmental, not dismissive, curious, because something was different. Not just the new hire, but what she represented. Daniel watched from a distance, not intervening, observing, the way she stood, the way she listened, the way she didn't try to fill silence with words. That mattered. Elaine handed Marla a tablet. Start simple, she said. Watch, take notes, ask questions later. Marla nodded. I can do that. Elaine glanced briefly toward Daniel, then back to Marla. We don't fix everything overnight, she said. But we don't ignore things either. Marla metargaze. That's a start. Elaine gave a small nod and stepped away. The floor continued moving around them. Work resumed, but differently. Annie leaned slightly toward her mother. You're really working here now, she whispered. Marla looked at the tablet in her hands, then around the room, then back at Annie. Yes, she said. Annie smiled. Not wide, not loud, just certain. Daniel turned slightly, preparing to step away. Then Annie's voice stopped him. Mr. Daniel? He looked back. Yes? She hesitated for just a second. Then, do you still see everything? The question was simple, but it wasn't about the room. Daniel glanced across the floor, at the people, at the movement, at the systems that had once worked, without being questioned, then back at her. I'm starting to, he said. Annie nodded. Good, she replied. And for the first time, the work truly began. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the operations floor had settled into something Marla could begin to read, not just the surface, the patterns underneath. From her desk, she watched the movement of people the way she used to watch patient flow in a hospital who paused too long, who rushed too quickly, who avoided certain conversations, who repeated the same steps more often than necessary. Systems spoke. You just had to listen. Annie sat beside her. Quieter now, her earlier curiosity settling into observation. She had found a notepad someone had left on the desk and was carefully drawing small boxes and arrows, copying what she saw on nearby computer screens without fully understanding it. "What are you doing?" Marla asked softly. "I'm making a map," Annie replied without looking up. "A map of what?" Annie shrugged slightly. "Of how everything moves," she said, "so I don't get lost." Marla studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That's a good idea." Across the floor, a raised voice broke the steady hum. Not loud, but sharp enough to shift attention. Marla looked up. Near the far row of desks, a younger employee stood stiffly, clutching a folder. Across from him, a supervisor spoke in a tone that wasn't quite anger but wasn't calm either. "You should have caught this before it reached me," the supervisor said, flipping through the pages. "This is basic. I followed the process," the employee replied, his voice tight. "Then the process failed," the supervisor snapped. "And that reflects on you." The exchange was brief, contained, but something about it lingered. The employee returned to his desk, shoulders slightly hunched, his movements tighter than before. Marla watched. Not the words, the reaction. Annie looked up from her drawing. "Is he in trouble?" she asked quietly. Marla didn't answer immediately. "He thinks he is," she said. Annie frowned slightly. "But did he do something wrong?" Marla glanced back toward the desk. "I don't know yet." She set the tablet down, carefully, then reached for her crutches. Annie straightened. "Are you going over there?" Marla nodded. "Yes." "Can I come?" Marla hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, "Stay close." They moved slowly across the floor, each step measured, the quiet rhythm of the crutches drawing brief glances but not interruption. When they reached the desk, the young employee looked up, surprised. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, instinctively defensive. "I'll fix it." Marla shook her head slightly. "I'm not here to correct you," she said. The words seemed to catch him off guard. "Oh," she glanced at the folder in his hands. "Can I see?" He hesitated, then handed it over. Marla scanned the pages, numbers, timelines, approval signatures. Everything appeared correct at first glance. Too correct. She flipped back, then forward again, then paused. "You followed the process exactly?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Step by step." Marla nodded slowly. "That's the problem." He blinked. "I don't understand." Marla shifted slightly on the crutches, adjusting her balance. "The process assumes the input is accurate," she said. "But no one verified the input." She pointed to a section on the page. "This data was entered twice, once manually, once automatically. They don't match." The employee leaned closer. His expression changed. I didn't see that." Marla nodded. "Because you weren't told to look for it." Silence settled between them. Then Annie spoke softly. "So, he didn't mess up?" Marla looked down at her. "No," she said. "The system did." The employee exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, not loudly, but sincerely. Marla handed the folder back. "Fix the input," she said. "Then the process will work." He nodded quickly. "I will." As they turned to move back, the supervisor who had spoken earlier approached. "I saw that," he said. His tone was measured now. Not defensive. Curious. Marla met his gaze. "Then you saw the issue," she replied. He nodded. "I did." A pause. "Then, most people wouldn't have caught that." Marla adjusted her grip on the crutches. "Most people weren't looking for it," she said. The supervisor studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Fair enough." He stepped aside. No argument, no pushback. Just acceptance. As Marla and Annie returned to the desk, Annie looked up at her. "You fixed it," she said. Marla shook her head slightly. "I pointed to it," she replied. "He fixed it." Annie thought about that, then nodded. "That still counts." Marla allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. Across the floor, Daniel had been watching. Not the entire exchange. Just enough. The movement. The decision to step in. The way she handled it. No authority claimed. No voice raised, just clarity. Elaine stepped beside him. She's already doing it, she said quietly. Daniel didn't look away. I know. Elaine folded her arms lightly. People are noticing. Daniel nodded. That's the point. A pause. Then Elaine added, change doesn't usually start this quietly. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly across the room. To Annie. Back at the desk, Annie had returned to her drawing, now adding a new line to her map. What are you adding? Marla asked. Annie didn't look up. A shortcut, she said. Marla raised an eyebrow slightly. A shortcut. Annie nodded, so people don't get stuck where they don't need to. Marla looked at the page, then back at the floor, then at Daniel, standing in the distance. And for the first time, she understood exactly why she was there. Not to fit into the system, but to make sure it didn't break people. And this time, no one was looking away. By early afternoon, the operations floor had begun to shift in ways that weren't immediately visible but were impossible to ignore once you noticed them. It wasn't louder. It wasn't faster. It was more aware. Marla remained at her desk, the tablet resting in front of her, but she wasn't looking at the screen anymore. She was watching the floor again. The same way she had all morning, except now. People were watching her too. Not openly, but differently. The young employee she had helped earlier moved with more confidence now, his posture straighter, his steps more certain. He checked his work again before submitting it, not out of fear, but understanding. Across the room, two others had begun double-checking their own inputs, quietly comparing notes. The system hadn't been told to change, but it had started to. Annie noticed it first. They're doing it again, she said softly, leaning closer to her mother. Marla glanced down. Doing what? Annie pointed with her pencil, subtle, careful not to draw attention. They're checking twice, she said. Like you said, Marla followed her gaze. She saw it. Small adjustments, quiet corrections, not because of orders, because of example. That's how it starts.